everyone. Welcome to another panel from ISU at beautiful Hanyang University in cooperation with COFS, SSP 25. We have an interesting panel for you tonight on the topic of prepping for Mars, getting ready to go on a Mars mission. I'll begin by introducing our panel. So on my left, we have Leonard de Guzman, who started off as an engineer and is continuing his education in law. He works in strategy now at a Fortune 50 company in technology, media, and telecom. He also is the regional lead for the Americas at the Maldives Space Research Organization, focusing on why space is important for his country. He's currently serving at SSP as Associate Chair of the Humanities Department. Next to him is Dr. Dimitris Stafouti, who is Assistant Professor at the International Institute of Air and Space Law of Leiden University. Leiden University. Her research is in international space law and policy, with particular interest in space applications, export control, privacy, and cybersecurity. Dimitra is active in multiple space law boards internationally and is serving at ISU as the chair of policy, economics, and law this summer at SSP. Next on our panel is Dr. Suyin Tan, associate professor in the teaching stream in the Geomatics program and director of Applied Geomatics Research Laboratory at the University of Waterloo in Canada. She has been with multiple ISU programs, really every single one of them. She specializes in geographic information systems, remote sensing, and spatial data analysis. Dr. Tan has a very interdisciplinary background in environmental sciences and spatial analysis methods. Next to her and rounding out our panel, we have Dr. Heather Alloway, who is an assistant professor of kinesiology at Louisiana State University in the US. She has a PhD in physiology, and she is now studying the impact of nutrition, reproductive function, and hormonal contraceptive use on skeletal health in young exercising women, including astronauts. She started working with astronauts during her postdoctoral training and is continuing this now as in her directorship of the Women's Physiology Research Lab and Skeletal Biology Lab at LSU. She's the chair of Human Performance in Space this year. So welcome, panel. Welcome, everyone. Leonard, if you would help me out, hold that for just a minute. So I'm going to start off. I'm Virginia Wittring, and I am the Chief Academic Officer of ISU. And I'm going to start off telling you a little bit about our question tonight. So we have been sending astronauts to space, particularly low Earth orbit, for a little while. And we feel like we've kind of got this figured out. We have a group of well-trained, very dedicated people who've been living and working in space for years now, decades even. We feel like we've got a grip on it. And there have been medical events that have happened in space, but we've been ready for them, and everything's been just fine. We haven't had any adverse events during a mission. We have thought about how to prepare for the ISS missions that we have undertaken. We think about things like the length of the mission, the number of crew, what activities they're going to do, and how should we prepare? What medications do we stock on the mission? What do we have ready for them? We give them some medicines that they can use and teach them what to do. But we know now, as we're thinking about missions that are farther away from Earth, where people will be gone for a longer period of time, we need to rethink our strategy. We're going to send people farther away from Earth. They'll be in a very limited resource environment. How are we going to keep them healthy? How are we going to do that? We can take some lessons from the militaries of the world. We can take some lessons from what we've done before in low Earth orbit. We know that there are some things that we have to think about. How How do we keep people healthy when they're eating preserved food for years at a time, and they don't have a big gymnasium, and they don't have a hospital? No nurses, no dentist, no surgical suite, no clinical lab, no imaging suite. One physician who has one specialty, maybe two. No other specialists. And we can't even really call another specialist because of the communication delay. And then everything's in low gravity, so none of our usual stuff works. What are we going to do? The communication delays, I think, are a serious problem that we're going to have to think about. The crew needs to be autonomous. They need to be able to take care of themselves without calling back to the Earth. There's no resupply. So either we pack everything they will need when they leave Earth, or we figure out ways for them to make whatever it is that they're going to need during their journey. And you can work with that kind of an idea. You can figure out some strategies. One that's time-tested through science fiction, bring a medical doctor with you. That's a good plan, but then you still have to prepare for when it's the medical doctor that needs treatment. We know we have a number of needs when it comes to health, and my colleague, Dr. Alloway, will talk some more about this. Health monitoring, medical diagnostics, therapeutics, prevention. And I just wanted to point out that these are needs for all of us. We all need these things. And I think that as we talk through this panel, we're going to find that that kind of idea holds for other disciplines as well. When we solve some of these issues for space, I think we're actually solving them for some people on Earth as well. So from here, I'm going to turn it over to Sue Yin. Your slides are queued up next.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Watring. And it's great to see the class today in the audience, and also welcome to those who are joining us online via YouTube and other channels. So I'm going to be talking a bit more about the role of space applications or satellites for prepping for Mars. And the funny thing is that in preparation for this event earlier today, had quite a few people coming up to me and saying that, what do you have to do with Mars, right? Because I'm always talking about Earth, as you all know in the core lectures, and I'm always advocating for using satellite applications for Earth. But indeed, there are lots of satellite applications for Mars as well, and I would actually argue that they are quite critical. Incidentally, remote sensing satellite technologies have been used for looking at other planets. For example, before I got into earth sciences and natural sciences, one of the very first remote sensing projects that I got involved with at Boston University was analyzing data from the Magellan probe, which was looking at the atmosphere of Venus. And because, as you know, Venus is a planet that is quite similar to Earth. And Mars, we are also very interested because that is next up. Oh, which way are we going here? They're lined up. No, other direction. There we go. So here is an elevation map of Mars. And I showed this map to a few of the space applications department folks on Monday because we were actually doing a workshop that was looking at remote sensing data for planning of Mars exploration rover landing sites. And this is an elevation map of Mars that is obtained from laser altimeter. It's the MOLA mission run by JPL, and this is showing you the whole entire disk of Mars. In lectures, we've been talking about the blue marble and how we're looking at the whole entire blue marble and we're alone on Earth. And I think it's also quite striking to look at Mars because it's not quite exactly what you might imagine. We always talk about, the red planet, but when you look at the surface of Mars, that you can see a lot of interesting detail and geology. And of course, our main interest is to look for signs of a watery past on Mars. So when you look at this MOLA image of elevation, so you can see the areas that are higher elevation are red, the areas that are lower elevation are blue, that there's a lot of differences in topography here. And there's different craters that might be of interest to look for that sign of a watery past on Mars. We have talked about in core lectures the role of data analysis. We have a team project all about artificial intelligence as well. So processing of data is also quite a challenge for Mars, but we're really interested in processing this data to plan for where will settlements be on Mars, where is the next landing site going to be for the next rover. This is an example of a GIS mapping application. It's a geographic information system where we have collected different types of data about Mars, including the terrain that we just talked about, but we can also plot where different probes have been, different rovers as well, and get a better understanding of the overall geology and topography of Mars, and that might highlight areas that we want to explore further. And how we explore this further is that we're using remote sensing imagery, and we can obtain very high resolution remote sensing imagery these days of Mars, less than 1 meter resolution. And all of this remote sensing has given us clues of interesting features on Mars. Depending on the time, depending on the resolution as well, we've talked about the 4 resolutions in class time and time and again. But there were, these are some images that you see here. The very top left was actually used for planning the landing site of Spirit, which was one of the very first Mars exploration rovers. When scientists first saw these imagery, they were quite excited, because if you look really closely at this imagery, there's streaks running across it, and there was this feeling that maybe there's rivers on Mars. Looking really closely, they turned out to be aeolian features, which are wind-derived features, and you'll notice that the craters actually have these streaks coming out of them. And looking really closely, we need to do more investigation with different types of remote sensing imagery, and of course, ground truth. And how we do ground truth on Mars right now, we're not in a situation yet to send someone to Mars, hopefully soon. We do this with rovers. And so the rovers are doing the ground truth for us, and we've had quite a few rovers. Here is some other imagery of the Spirit rover and Opportunity rover. And just to show you that with remote sensing imagery, oh, there's a little bit of blackout there, okay. So with remote sensing imagery, we can actually see evidence of where these rovers have landed, as well as where they have gone. And so in the top 2 images that you see here, on the left is where Spirit rover landed, and the rover tracks are going across the surface. On the right-hand side is Opportunity rover, that you can actually see the landing rocket blast effects, evidence of it landing. So these rovers are real, right? So there's been lots of myths about whether these were actually landed or not. Of course, we know that they landed because they returned imagery like what you see at the very bottom of the slide. And that's a form of ground truth, so that we can verify our investigation hypotheses, what kind of terrain is there, what kind of rock structure, and so on. And we've explored the Mars surface relatively well, but there's still a lot that we have not discovered yet. So this is a map just to show the landing sites of Mars exploration rovers, as well as Phoenix probes and so on. And you can see that there's particular areas on Mars that we really tend to focus on. The Gusev crater on the right-hand side is one of them, which Spirit Opportunity landed in before. And there's still lots more to come. Speaking of satellite applications, we are still using satellite data, remote sensing data, to plan landing sites for Mars exploration rovers. This is an example of Curiosity, which was much larger than Spirit and Opportunity. When we plan for these landing sites, quite a few variables come into play. Elevation is probably the big one, but we're also interested in maybe looking at the type of geology, the type of minerals that can also be determined with hyperspectral imaging these days. And this is some real data that is using terrain data to plot where landing sites might be. So one last image here, just to show you that we can also use radar data which we've talked about in class. And radar data is an active sounder, and we can look at the polar ice cap on Mars. So there is a polar ice cap on Mars. There's quite some similarity with Earth. And here are some world geology maps as well. And we can use GIS to map different areas, overlay them on top, and mark where potential landing sites may be. And just to end off here, this is a geology map, just to show you a different view of Mars. And we're trying to look at the different types of soil type, grain size, and that might also give us clues of where maybe past water beds were and signs of a watery past of Mars. So just to get you thinking, and I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Watring.
Thank you, Dr. Tan. So that's amazing. It's amazing how much we can learn from here about Mars. And I love that we're using this information to plan our next missions, not just where rovers go, but maybe where people are going to go next. Dr. Allaway, would you like to add to the conversation about what the people might encounter when they're there, and what we need to do to prepare for them?
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of things. It's a matter, there are 3 different questions there. It's what do we know, and do we know enough to get them to Mars safely and healthy? When they are on Mars, how do we keep them healthy? And then third question is, how do we get to a point where we can be sustainable on Mars and have a colony there that is self-sustaining within a population of itself? So the answer is, we don't know enough about any of it. Right? There is the issue in the spacecraft getting us to Mars, that is the shielding going to be enough to protect us from radiation? But we also don't fully understand yet what that continuous exposure to that high energy radiation is going to do to any of our physiologic systems, but especially our cardiovascular system, which is very important in maintaining broad health. Our musculoskeletal system, which is going to be important for us to be able to walk around the surface of Mars once we get there. And then the third one, very important, is our brain. What is it going to do to our brain, to our cognition, to our ability to understand and continue to be autonomous? When we get to Mars, how are we going to stay safe? Because Mars doesn't have an atmosphere. So anything that we live in on Mars is going to have to have additional radiation protection, but also, do we know enough about the soil of Mars to understand how the soil and the soil getting into the habitat may influence our lungs and our ability to breathe on top of everything else? We also don't know if the Martian gravity is going to be enough to help us sustain our cardiovascular and our musculoskeletal systems. And then lastly, if we're going to think about colonizing other planets, will the radiation, will the low gravity influence the birth of humans, the birth of any mammals or birds or fish, or anything that we take with us as a food source, on top of all of those things? So there's a lot of questions that we still need to answer before I think we can safely get there and safely stay there.
Absolutely, thank you. So now in our fantasy world, we've thought about some things to prepare for humans on Mars. Dr. Staffuti, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how do we really arrange to do this? What policies do we need to have in place to manage to launch such an expedition? Do we need to think through our laws?
I would say it's always a good idea to think about the legal framework, assess whether the existing one is sufficient, and if not, which areas we need to develop further. The purpose of the regulation is always to protect a legitimate interest. And in the case of a trip to Mars, surely among the main legitimate interests are the safety of the people that travel to Mars, when they stay there, possibly when they travel further or when they return, and the preservation of the space environment. We always have to keep in mind that this is a place where we go to. There are certain circumstances Do we respect them? Do we change them for the better? Should we try to not change them, at least for the worst? The existing legal framework we have, a set of international space treaties, includes some general principles in this regard. It's telling us that astronauts are the envoys of humankind, and should they be in distress or in an emergency in outer space, whoever is in a position to do so, they should render them assistance. But that is rather broad. It doesn't tell us anything beyond that. And because going to Mars, let alone sending several missions to Mars, is a little difficult, who is going to render them this assistance? So the question then becomes, how safe should the circumstances be before we decide that we send people and then we send more people and they stay there? It depends on the technology that we develop. Of course, there are scientific, technological, possibly financial benefits in actually developing a technology that takes us to Mars. So we should take that into account, but we should also take into account that all of these have to have at least a minimum safety criterion, the same way we have in other transportation means that developed throughout the decades and the centuries, and apply to the extent feasible something similar for the people that go there. When it comes to the space environment, I think especially going to Mars is an interesting case, because when we're thinking about a closer environment, that of the moon, we are doing our best to preserve it. And the law tells us that we should not harmfully contaminate it, that we should not cause adverse changes, harmfully interfere with the activities of others. But now we're discussing about going further and potentially settling there. Does this mean that we start treating that environment as an environment that we have to make our own, terraforming, as we sometimes refer to it? At the moment, there are planetary protection principles that tell us what we can and cannot do. They focus very much on the scientific exploration of those celestial bodies, and they try to preserve them. But sending even initial infrastructure, some rovers, possibly creating some settlements, then sending humans, more humans, creating larger communities, is going to have an impact on the environment. How far does this go? What are the rules that we have to add to the existing regime? That doesn't give us a lot of detail. And an underlying perspective in all of that is whether that's more on the policy, maybe ethical consideration. Are we entitled here on the Earth to make rules for other planets that are not our planet and the satellite of our planets? And if so, who should do that? All of us? The people who may end up going to Mars? The people who know better for whatever reason? Or do we leave it a little bit to the development of the whole mission? We send people, they create their community, and usually from the community comes a certain set of rules. We do have an agreement specific to the moon that takes into account the features, the special features of the moon. Perhaps we could have an agreement for Mars. What this agreement should include, up for our discussion later and a reflection, but I think it should build on the regime that we already have, reasonable, applicable, works for our human communities, and develop it where, in areas where there are gaps, where we need clarifications, where we need to adapt things to living on Mars. It should be exciting from a legal perspective, because that would be really pushing the boundary of the law. I'm not sure we can go further than that to actually regulate.
I don't know about the rest of you, but when a lawyer tells me something's going to be exciting, I get very nervous. So you make me wonder, how long would it take to put together some kind of Mars treaty?
It depends, which is the classic response we always give. When it comes to other space treaties, it takes a long, long time. Because the mechanisms we have in place, the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space that primarily discusses, negotiates, adopts international treaties, has a consensus mechanism. All the countries represented have to agree, and that takes time. They discuss issues concerning space traffic management or space resource utilization, most recently, for a few years, to issues like the definition and delimitation of outer space for decades without a resolution. So there is the challenge, the way we regulate space activities internationally at the moment, that is not very time-friendly But when there is an imminent activity, the same way the first space launch was imminent back in the 50s and the 60s, when the first space treaty came to being, maybe when we actually are on the verge of sending technology, sending people out there, we realize this as a necessity and we move a little bit faster. I cannot predict. It would surely take a good decade. We have to really understand what we have to regulate, ask the people who know, calculate all factors involved, negotiate it, of course, come up with something good, then complete that framework and proceed with traveling to Mars. So it depends on how urgent we understand regulation to be before going there.
So I think Dr. Allaway would agree with me. We probably need at least a decade, maybe more like 3, to get ready for the human research that needs to be done on Mars. So I think we can grant the lawyers a little bit of time while we do our science projects too. Yeah, I think that can work. So you brought up an interesting question about being inclusive, about who is making these decisions. And Leonard, I wonder if you would comment a little bit on including the countries of the world who don't currently have space agencies in some of these discussions and plans.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much for that prompt, Dr. Watring. And also, a big thank you to everyone out in the audience for sharing the time and attention with us all tonight. But yeah, thank you for the warm introduction a little earlier. As much as I would like to claim, and as much as it would delight me to claim to be Maldivian, I can't. I'm an Australian of Filipino heritage residing in the United States. Those are different parts of my identity, how I identify as an individual, as a human. I also identify as an engineer. I also identify as now trying to make my way through law. The identity that one has is actually a really important piece. It defines so much else downstream as part of the decision-making process of why we go about doing something. There's the consideration of lots of different aspects of identity. People aren't just the one thing. They can have multiple characteristics and multiple traits. Which one is the predominant one or the most important one or the one that we give the most weight to when making decisions? That implies that multiple of them can be included in the decision making. There's also now then the elements of individual identity or collective identity. Let's say there's a crisis on Mars and the crew that are there will perish unless a mission that is part way on its back, part of the way on return to Earth, turns around and heads back out to Mars to collect them at the sacrifice of resources for greater other missions. Think the Martian storyline. Or what happens if Earth is no longer inhabitable or near no longer inhabitable, and that initial departure or that initial mission ends up being a one-way mission, and they end up having to recreate a human colony from embryos on Mars and sacrifice the rest of their lives and their beings to help stand up the next continuation of the species. Think now the interstellar storyline. So not just identity as an individual characteristics or traits, but the collective identity as well as individual identity is important. And I would advocate that be the first step or the first question that would need to be answered. Are we going to Mars as humans? Are we going to Mars as Australians? Are we going to Mars as representatives of governments or as representatives of commercial companies or as representatives of non-government organizations or entities? Because then that determines all the follow-on steps. Are we there to try and generate commercial value and return value to shareholders on Earth to boost an economy here that is separate from an economy on Mars, which is now a transfer of resources and wealth between two different points? Are we going there to try and establish a community and an environment that can allow the continuation of the species? Does that then shape how much we invest on life here on Earth? Because there is a requirement for resource investment for that type of endeavor. And none of those questions can be answered unless the first one of the identity that we are carrying as we go to Mars. And then from there, that then starts to allow the shaping of the why we are going there. And of course, it is very much important to take care of how can we keep humans alive. But are we just going there as humans, or are we going there as life that originated on Earth? Because that then now means we may be needing to take with us other life forms or other beings? You know, does the unique conditions or environment on Mars have an impact on birth and pregnancies, or not just on humans, but on mammals and other animals and growth of plants? Are we going to be taking plants with us in order to continue to feed and sustain us whilst we're there? To your point earlier, Dr. Watring, to bring all the supplies with us on a one-way mission. So that identity question of who it is that we are as we're going to Mars is the first one that I would advocate needs to be answered. That then now allows the shaping of the rest of the questions of why it is that we're going there. Because we can figure out ways to ensure that humans can survive in the unique conditions of Mars, whether it be gene editing or whether it be engineering an environment around us that can protect us from the unique environment and harshness on Mars. We can figure out the engineering solutions of efficient propulsion systems to get there in a way that is timely enough to allow return missions and resupply to make the engineering load of sustaining Mars lower. There's a whole bunch of engineering problems that we will be able to solve and that many of you in this room are solving and will go on to solve in the future. But why are we doing those?
That's a really good question, and it does deserve to be at the core of our discussion. I think maybe engineers and scientists have a tendency to do new things as soon as they figure out that they can, and then sometimes later we think about whether or not we should, or maybe what are the parameters we should put on doing those activities. And this may be a little backwards, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the analogy I like to use is whether it be problem solving or technology innovation or product development, there is expending effort and energy and investing resources to try and solve a specific problem. So you can start from anywhere, but you're always trying to land on the one particular target. Then there's the inverse of that, of problem solving, creating, discovering, where you're starting from a particular point and you're going in any and all directions. And you're doing it purely for curiosity, inquisitiveness, pursuit of the arts or science or discovery or creation. And as you go along that journey, you discover things and create things that are useful in various environments for whatever reason, based on different identities and use cases and applications and why behind things. But it's that initial step of discovery and creation for curiosity or inquisitiveness. And so I like to use those two analogies as we talk about problem solving, discovery, and engineering. Is it for a particular purpose, or is it starting from one place and then going in all the different directions?
Fascinating, fascinating. You also brought up money, and this is at the heart of space always, right? You know, what we're able to do depends on finance. And Dimitra, you are involved in questions of intellectual property protection and export control, that kind of issue. If we're going to be going on these very large, very complicated, multi-year kinds of missions, I think it's likely we're going to need financial contributions from multiple sources, and that could be countries, that could be businesses. How is this going to work out so it's fair and we don't have partners taking advantage of each other, and we still manage to get things done?
That's a very nice question, very challenging one for sure. So far, we are going further in space with government-funded missions or missions by international organizations who see those missions as part of research and exploration, benefiting knowledge primarily here on the Earth. This is why they invest. Is that enough to sustain a trip to Mars? Likely not, and there is nothing wrong with commercializing certain parts of space activity as long as we do it properly. Properly how? There are certain red lines, and here I will make some connections with the regulation. We cannot appropriate areas of outer space, for instance. We have to take certain conditions into account when we use resources, and we eventually are going to need resources. And to understand maybe what are the parameters we should take into account, what are the economic aspects, business aspects, incentives that we should take into account. I think the debate that we have had so far in the past maybe 10 years around the utilization of space resources is really a good example of how we can change our minds, the more we understand what we're talking about. When we first started discussing space resource utilization, around 2015, 10 years already, it was because some companies saw a business opportunity behind it. That was the basis of the discussion then. And of course, the reaction from countries and other, in industries in other countries were negative, thinking that this can not only be a business opportunity because it will exclude eventually those who do not afford to go there, do not have an interest, cannot support it. That is one aspect to certainly take into account. It should not be exclusive just for one company, one country, a group of countries to make profit. However, we realized quickly that this is not only about business, first of all, because making money out of that takes a little bit of effort, but it is about scientific exploration, developing technology that will eventually create a market, push further technology, discovering a lot of things. So we're talking about the synergy between business, technology, science that brings together more stakeholders. And coming back to the issue of resources, we understood that it's not a way to become billionaires. It is a way to sustain our trip to space, back, or further. It is a way to sustain life on a certain planet. And if we think of it that way, we take many more parameters than the actual finances into account. So, of course, we appropriate a certain area that we need to, with notifying others, with making sure that others do not disagree. Of course, we use resources to the extent that we need to the extent that we do not interfere with the environment. If we happen to exclude someone, because it's not very easy to just create a settlement and everyone comes in for safety reasons, for many other reasons, surely we can set up a safety zone as long as it's to the extent necessary for the certain period that we do this activity. So, taking all stakeholders' interest into account, thinking a little bit beyond the shorter term gain, which may be financial, and sometimes, especially in the space sector, we do need maybe a business initiative, someone who's telling us, let's go to Mars, to make us think, should we go with them? That's a good way to start the discussion, and we start the discussion internationally. That's really very important. We open it internationally. Whichever country wants to participate has the space to do so. Countries that for whatever reason do not want to be part of it or want to come back later to the discussion should have the space to do so. And at the end, we learn from the mistakes or things that haven't gone great in technological and scientific development on the Earth when we're thinking about going forward to outer space.
Yes, Leonard?
Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Stafudi. There's a story that I want to share, and it's one that I heard when I was at SSP 23. I went through in 22, but I came back to lecture in the Humanities Department in 2023 in Brazil. Can I get a woo from anyone who was participant or staff in 23? There's a handful of you that are around. I apologize, her name escapes me. If anyone can remember, please tell everyone else so that she gets credit. I was speaking to a TEA at SSP 23 in Brazil over dinner one of the nights. And she was Brazilian and had family that was from the Amazon region. And she was describing a time where she was spending some time with her family in the Amazon region, and one of the members of the community was ill or sick. And so someone went deep into the jungles or the mountains or deep away from the area that they were living in to try and find a particular plant, and then claimed a small portion of the root from that plant that they would then process, and use medicinally to try and cure the ailment. And the question that was being asked of the local Amazonian at the time was, you're only taking a very small slice of the root. We just spent hours traversing through the jungle to get here, and you're only taking a small piece of the root to then traverse all those several hours back to then make a small amount of medicine from it and administer. What happens if the person gets sick again? Why don't you take a larger portion of the root? And the response was, what do you mean? I only need this amount of root. I only need this amount to make the dosage to treat this particular ailment. This is the amount of resources that I need right now to solve this particular problem statement. I don't understand why I would take more than that. That was just such a foreign concept. And so that story still retains with me now, and I wanted to share it. One, that it came from SSP 23, and two, that it's relevant to the particular discussion around resources, and as you brought up, Dr. Stafudi, our ISRU. And the other thing that came to my mind as you prompted the question, Dr. Watring, and as you're responding, Dr. Stafudi, was I identify as a systems engineer, and I'm sure many of you out there do as well. And so when we talk about investing financially in trips to Mars, the question that goes through my mind is, where are we drawing the system boundary? If we're just drawing the system boundary around Earth, and we're trying to optimize that system for all living beings on Earth, and we happen to make this external reach out to another part that is outside of the system, which might end up involving extracting resources and bringing it back, that ends up being a very different outcome from if we draw a system boundary that includes Earth and Mars, and we do what we can, we make investments to optimize everything inside that system boundary. Because now the outcome that you get from an engineering perspective, just like finances are a resource just like anything else. And if you take the engineering mindset of resource management within a constraint, the problem statement that you're solving, the solution becomes very different compared to if you just draw it around Earth. And so that's one of the ways that I try and think about, going to the moon, going to Mars from a financial investment perspective and engineering problem statement solving perspective when we think about, resources.
That's fascinating. Thank you for bringing that up. So the idea of humanity expanding its boundaries to include more than just the Earth in our territory, if you will, that just expands the size of the zero-sum game, right? I'd also like to point out that we had a nice little pharmacology anecdote that didn't come from me, so thank you. So we've been talking about ways that we could support a long-duration exploration mission to Mars, and Dr. Tan brought up some information that we've been collecting from Mars already with our many rovers and our many different kinds of remote sensors. If we go there, when we go there, what business opportunities could arise in that situation that we don't already have?
Yeah, thanks very much, Dr. Watering. So I think that we are so focused right now on how to get to Mars and how to get a human being to Mars. But what are we going to do once we get there, basically? So I think that it's really going to be about survival and replicating what we have basically here on Earth and the Earth-like conditions on Mars so that we can actually have a long-term settlement, a long-term presence on Mars. I think that in terms of space applications that we've been talking, well, I was referring a lot to satellite imagery that can help us with site selection of ideal places that we could have a settlement. That's really going to do with the type of terrain, the type of conditions, but also in terms of solar energy. So a lot of factors go into the ideal site where we should be on Mars. In terms of business opportunities, though, I think it's going to be a while, to get to business opportunities, but probably with ISRU that Dr. Stafudi was talking about, I think with resource utilization, we are having all of these very high resolution geological maps, and it's to really look at which sites are really of interest. Are there going to be deposits of valuable minerals, for example, that we could mine, that we could potentially bring back? So that's some immediate, potential monetary type of examples. I do think that it's really important to think about what technologies could be applied from Earth and bringing to Mars. And in terms of space applications, that might also be with robotic technologies as well. For example, just today, we had a departmental visit to a smart farming facility. I think a few folks in the audience were there. And with smart farming, we looked at robotics, automations, the role of AI as well. And I think that a lot of those technologies that we're developing here on Earth can also be applied in Mars to enable us to settle there and to have a sustainable future on Mars.
Thank you. So you're giving us some projects to do on Mars now. I think I'm going to ask Dr. Allaway to follow up on this. Now we're giving the humans some jobs to do on Mars. What kinds of occupations are we ready to take on in this very unusual environment? And what are the things we need to think about with these different occupations? Our astronauts so far have been living in luxury in low Earth orbits. If we're going to be extracting resources, mapping terrain, these are really different from current astronaut activities.
Yeah, so saying that, the way astronauts train before they go will have to drastically change. The education they get about things that they're not experts in is going to have to amplify, kind of to the way that the military men from Apollo had to learn a lot of different things to be able to go to the moon and collect rocks and know the sample preparation kinds of things. But when it comes to going to Mars, there's going to have to be a lot more autonomy and a lot more problem solving, because as we saw in The Martian, a plant biologist had to fix a whole lot of stuff with duct tape. He also had to turn on a rover that had been buried in dirt for goodness knows how many years at that point. And so understanding past technology that we could have access to on Mars that might become useful, but also knowing how to fix the current technology, and have people with varying backgrounds to be able to do that. So we're going to need a doctor of some sort, potentially a nurse would be okay. We're going to have an engineer who is also someone who likes to dabble in things like auto repair, right? It's not all just computers. There's going to be other things we need to fix, right? Computers are not going to help us with everything, because that dust could destroy those computers. We're going to have people out there who understand plants and plant biology, because that's going to be the easiest way that we're going to be able to sustain ourselves from the beginning. But it's probably going to have to be more aquatic plant biology than terrestrial plant biology at the start, more than anything else. And I think having a basic understanding, or a crew that has a broad interdisciplinary kind of understanding of the world of biology, but also medicine, but also engineering, but also physics and radiation protection is going to be necessary. The jobs aren't going to be any different than they are here, but it's that each person is going to have to be more interdisciplinary than they've ever had to be before.
What a great commercial for ISU you just did. Thank you. We'll be using that segment later. Absolutely. So I'm really interested in your questions too. So who would like to ask questions?
Hey, first of all, thank you. My question is mainly for Dimitra and Leonard. When we get there, we're going to have some problems of enforcement, not criminal law, but as for every aspect of international law. Thank you, Rod. So I wonder, what do you think about that? Because when we get there, someone can just say, well, no, I don't want to do that, and we will not have the possibility to enforce it. So.
Very good question. And I sense that it would be coming, because it is a very reasonable one. If something happens on Mars, we cannot send the space police from the Earth to enforce the law. That's why when we build the law, we have to understand where it applies and how it will apply. And maybe to the question I wondered earlier, what should be included in a legal framework for Mars? One of the last provisions should be the enforcement. And not only practically and realistically speaking, but fairly speaking, the enforcement should primarily come from the community there. It is their community, and enforcement is important because it is what holds our society together. Without enforcement, we can just go ahead and violate whatever rule is or is not binding, but then we don't live in the convenient societies that we often do. And one thing to certainly add to the regulation, and an important one.
Wonderful question. Thank you so much for asking. I have a couple of thoughts on this one. I think that conflict is it's almost a luxury. If you're in an environment where you can choose to identify as being from one city versus another city, or from one university versus another university, then it becomes very easy to, at least in that competitive sports context, enjoy the banter between the teams and hope that your team wins over the other team. Your state wins over the other state's team. Or at the Olympics, your country wins over another country. Or at Eurovision, your country wins over the other country. If you're in an environment where and that's because maybe your identity of belonging to that city or that state or country or university is slightly larger than your identity as belonging to a particular, even within like a country context. If you identify more so as belonging to a city or a state, it means you're doing that as a higher consideration than identifying as belonging to the country. And that's why you're able to say, well, I hope my city wins at this sports game instead of your city. What happens if you're in an environment where everyone identifies as the same characteristic or demographic? I identify as a human, whether it be on Mars or Earth or in space en route or permanently stationed on the moon. I identify as a human. And if that's the first identity that comes to mind as you're interacting with the world around you or interacting with the environment around you and the people around you, then the chance of conflict, if everyone else is identifying as human, I believe will be a lot less. And so in the context of there being conflict on Mars between two parties that requires enforcement by a third party who has some kind of primacy or deputization or empowerment by a government that's perhaps been voted in or elected by the people of Mars, that's a luxury. That means that things are functioning well enough that people can identify as like, no, I'm from this particular crater or I'm from this particular part of Mars. First and foremost, before they identify as being a human on Mars. Now, that doesn't necessarily answer the question of how do you execute enforcement. That was a little bit of an argument around like, here's a utopia where we don't need the concept of enforcement. But the other bit that I try and add in there is that analogy that I gave starts to get a little bit scary, because what types of things encourage people to all identify first and foremost as the same identity, right? And then you think of Independence Day, right? You think of other types of representations in film and humanities. You'll get a little bit of this on Wednesday, August 6th. That threatens that particular collective identity, which means that now rises to the surface as the one that you identify with strongest. It's no longer your particular city or state or sports team or college. And so, there's extra elements there around that. But that was just my way of kind of answering. I'm hoping that the environment on Mars is a productive and positive one, and one that doesn't, a collective identity such that there is a need for enforcement.
Hi, thank you so much for the panel. So my question maybe is more of an opinion from maybe each of you. At the current pace that we're exploring to go to Mars and develop the infrastructure for human support and search for life, I'm skeptical that maybe at the pace that we're going, we might be missing a few things, or that desire to solve problems is kind of taking over rather than considering the environment that we might potentially damage or the humans in the environment that we're going to put in. Going back to your story about the plants in the jungle and going back to what you said about the soil, we don't even know how that's going to interact with humans there. So, and I'm an engineer, I'm all for solving problems, but this one really worries me. Do you personally think that we're being responsible enough with the pace that we're going to explore Mars without damaging the environment there and for us as well?
I guess I can start. I think there are certain bits that we are going at a good pace. There are certain bits that we are behind the 8 ball, and there are certain bits that we are way too ahead of where everything else is. And so when it comes to kind of the engineering of getting there, we're on track, right? When it comes to human health and understanding of that kind of aspect, we're behind the 8 ball in comparison. But when it comes to other things like environmental protection, at least us going there and landing there, we're well ahead of where we need to be, and that's because of the protections we've put in place prior to, because of sending robots. But all in all, it's a mixed bag. I do think, and that's my personal opinion, I don't know if everyone else might agree or not.
Well, maybe I'll make a few comments before the other panelists do. I do think that when you see some of the imagery that we showed in some of the slides, that you see evidence of the robots, the rovers, on Mars already. So we are leaving, some footprints, and then what we're seeing is that those footprints, it takes a very long time to go away. So this is something that I think we do really have to consider, especially since there's so much talk about ISRU, about mining, on other planets. I do really hope, as a sustainability person, that we don't repeat the mistakes that we've done here on Earth onto other planets. And in particular because the environment on Mars is not quite as dynamic in a way that we have here on Earth, where we have our mountains, our oceans, and so on. And the damage that we inflict onto the surface of Mars with mining activities and so on can have quite permanent long-term effects. So I think that this is we've done quite a lot here on Earth, and I hopefully before we actually go and have a permanent presence on Mars, that we can give more thought as to the types of lessons that we've had here on Earth, and maybe apply them more thoughtfully in the Mars environment.
It is worth wondering whether we should do something just because we can do something. Should we go to Mars just because we can go to Mars? And I think the decisive criterion is whether we are going to be responsible when we go or not. If we are responsible, it's certainly worth for the experience, for whatever we learn. Even if it is a mistake and we realize it, it is a lesson learned. And to better understand what's responsible, I think the regulation plays a very good balancing role. It tells us what should and should not happen. And I hope that gives you a little bit of a perspective. Since we're quoting, I heard from Neil deGrasse Tyson at a podcast, not in person, unfortunately. His question, if we are discussing terraforming Mars, why don't we terraform the Earth first? We have the tools to live in an environment that is better than what we have at the moment on the Earth. It really depends on the humans. And if I look around, I'm a little more reassured than I used to be that we understand the problems, so we're less likely to repeat them.
Yeah, wonderful question. Thank you for asking it. A couple of thoughts, actually two thoughts around it. I think I very much agree. I think it's really important to ensure that we have a clear why we're wanting to go to Mars, or a really clear why of going to Mars, right? Not wanting to go where we're going. It's not just intent anymore. There's preparation happening. I also do advocate for the engineering and human performance and all the other disciplines work to be happening, even if we haven't yet quite figured out the why crisply and clearly. Because there may be something that happens or a realization that triggers a very clear, crisp why we should be going to Mars. And if we're not prepared to go, then it might be too late, and the why might miss its chance, or we might be subject to whatever risk it is that's causing us to go. And so all of the work that we're doing in low Earth orbit to understand space and operations in space, all the work that we're trying to do to the moon, all for the intent of getting to Mars eventually, I believe should still continue, again, in a sustainable way. But even if we haven't quite figured out the why, I still think all of that needs to happen, just in case there's a reason for going and we're not yet ready to go. The second thought that I have is, I think we're at a little bit of an advantage. Mars has positioned us to be a little bit of an advantage to do it right. I'm trying to use an analogy here of a startup that disrupts an institution. If there's a large corporation or publicly traded company that's rather institutionalized, that is, it's large machinery and it's scaled, which is part of the reason why it's in that form. If it's to try and do something new, if it's to try and change, it is an incredible amount of effort, right? You hear that analogy in MGB and in business classes, big ship, small rudder, right? To change directions, to do something different, if you're large and institutionalized, it is very challenging. And that's often why a disruptor like a startup that's starting greenfield from zero, designing something for a particular purpose right from the first time, and then iterating on it and continuing to improve at a much faster rate, can often disrupt these larger institutions. No different from an Earth and Mars analogy. If we're trying to change Earth, yes, we should absolutely try. If we're trying to change, it's not going to be easy and it'll take a lot of effort, not just resources, but shifting of mindsets and culture change to get to the form that we might need to be to treat Earth the right way that it should be treated. If we're going to Mars for the very first time, we have the chance that every decision we make is one that treats it the right way. And so we're already at an advantage. The challenge now is making sure that we actually execute it the right way. Because at the other end of the spectrum, you have an analogy of going into a hotel room or an Airbnb that's not yours, that's new, that you can treat as if you don't own it. You're just renting it. And then you leave and you've not treated it the way that it should have been. So it still needs to be executed the right way, but I think the fact that we haven't yet gone there already puts us at in a good standing position.
I thank you very much for the talk. It was really very interesting. My question, I really want to bring it to real context, especially the geopolitical contexts. Because Mars or any area has never been an issue. Issue is always about us. Today we have a much more complex geopolitical situations. We have two powers in space. I don't want to mention that I kind of competition, but also do not really talk. As if that was not complicated enough, we have also the private sector, big companies that also are joining the same objective, competing among themselves, sometimes competing with the governments, and with sometimes a little leverage from the government. I want maybe just to, from a legal point of view or human point of view, just elaborate on that. How do you see the scenario likely to be if we get to Mars and for some reason there's some common interest that all those parties would want to have to fight over that particular interests? Thank you.
Wonderful question. Thank you so much for asking. A couple of thoughts. One, I do think that the entities that go to Mars will first and foremost identify as a representative of a company or a corporation or a nation or a government or a military force, and therefore that will create an environment of potentials for conflict over a common interest or resource on Mars. And so unless that is solved, that common identity problem statement that I keep bringing up, unless that is solved in some way, which if it is, then maybe there isn't conflict because we're all doing it for the benefit of all of humanity or all living beings on Earth or in the solar system. But unlikely, so yes, I think that that's some flavor of contention will be present there. I think it's now a question of, it's also a little bit of a question of who first, because it's not necessarily going to be 6 different parties, an NGO, a government that's civilian, a government that's military, a commercial organization and a non-profit or something, and an individual all going and arriving at Mars at the same time and having to debate it and figure it out live simultaneously in the one moment. I think it's more likely that one entity will make it there first, and then that will kind of set the tone for everything else. And so now it's a question of, well, if the first entity to get there is a commercial one that might be trying to, driven by returning value to shareholders on Earth, versus a government that's militarized, that has a national security remit, versus a private individual that has, private wealth behind them and it's making the decision as an individual. Each of those are very different profiles, and there's lots of other profiles, and whichever one gets there first is, I think, very much going to set the tone for everything else, right? It's no different from when you're, in a negotiation, the first one to anchor has the advantage, right? Like when exploring somewhere new, the first one to get there or arrive has the advantage. And so whoever that entity is going to largely shape the first wave of, as you described, conflict and negotiation. And now what it looks like in terms of it being a physical, military armed conflict, whether it be through international organizations like a UN or equivalent perspective, where it's being done negotiated through courts perhaps on Earth. I'm not quite sure what form that can take. I think it'll largely be driven by, whoever gets there first. And, the only hope or aspiration that, I and others can have is that it's an entity that gets there, that even though they might be incorporated or instituted in a particular way on Earth, that they are genuinely doing it with a vision of space for all, and they are genuinely doing it for a wholesome, inclusive way. With that mindset of inclusiveness and space for all attitude that ISU is very much intending to foster. So that's, I think, the biggest hope that I might have, that doesn't happen. Otherwise, whoever gets there first will set the tone for everyone else, and it'll be on them to try and encroach however they best can, whether with whatever toolkit they have, whether it be a military force, whether it be courts and or a legal response.
Let me also say that international space law was developed at a time of very high geopolitical tension. And we're talking about tension of going headfirst to a nuclear war. And what we see in the text of the treaties is principles such as outer space being free for everyone to use and explore, conducting space activities in the interest of all countries, in accordance with the UN Charter for promoting international peace and security. Those are principles that were established at the time of high tensions, and those are principles that are valid today, and they will be valid when we go to Mars. We have to take them with us. They are there unless we change them fundamentally, and I don't see that happening. So whatever is built, whether it's a new law, just a new society, just new contact on Mars, it has to be built on those premises. You correctly pointed out that sometimes there are some countries that seem to be isolated, emphasis on SIM, things change, they have a lot of things to gain from their cooperation. We still, for example, have the International Space Station functioning with lower hopes for the future, but it is still out there. These two countries have become more, it's a handful of countries, and the dynamics among them change because they understand how much they have to gain. That said, everything that's happening in space comes from other areas of activities on the Earth, so it's not particular to space, something we can change in space. It is reflected a little bit, but I have hope that because we have at least those principles, we build on those, and it can only lead us to a good outcome.
Just a quick comment that I think that competition is always a good thing, right? So I think competition is drives innovation. And thank goodness that we have the commercial sector right now. We have private players who are, so you mentioned like, you know, 2 major space powers, the geopolitics involved. And I think it's a really exciting time right now with the private players, you know, in this situation where we're having private landers on the moon, for example. So I think also in the geopolitical context that you just mentioned, I also encourage us to not necessarily think of ourselves as victims, you know, of the situation which we're in right now, that there's also agency to each of us, you know, individually. And ISU is probably one of those examples, really, because you can see here at ISU that we do have participants from various countries. We do have participants from both of those major players that you just mentioned. And so in these venues that we can really share our ideas and foster that collaboration in more of an informal setting, but I think that, you know, there's still a lot that we can do. And I encourage us to not think of ourselves as victims of the current geopolitical situation. It's a really exciting time for space.
This has become a very interesting topic for us to talk about. Thank you so much for asking the question. I just wanted to close this answer with an observation or 2 or 3. One is that the human beings that may or may not be going to space, we're animals, right? So animals fight over resources. It's part of being an animal. And I don't think we're going to change this in human nature either. However, it does give me hope when we have people who can think about this issue the way that we are this evening, and people who can speak to the important points the way that we are this evening. If individual entities, individual humans or businesses or countries or governments are approaching space exploration for whatever reason they want, thinking along a single line, I think it's potentially dangerous. But when we bring the interdisciplinarity, the multidisciplinarity, the intercultural, international ideas that ISU is fostering, I think this really changes how we approach the whole idea. I think that what everyone here in this audience is doing now is really important for the future of space exploration. So thank you for asking.
Thank you very much again for the insightful panel discussion. I guess I will latch on to the last question that was asked, but I would frame this more onto a human performance / astronaut health point of view, although I will leave it open for anyone to answer. Do you have an opinion on the sometimes recurring debate over whether it should this time be a private company, let's think, you know, SpaceX's aspirations, to be the first one to send people to Mars, as opposed to keeping the legacy approach of a national agency-led mission when it comes to, you know, all the issues that we would be facing with keeping astronauts alive and all the, you know, the landscape around that. Thank you.
I guess I'll start, and then maybe Demetria can probably chime in on this, because there's a little bit of ethics and policy production there. I don't have a problem with it being commercialized or keeping it government focused, but the issue I face and in the back of my mind have when it comes to the privatized side is who is going and how healthy are they to begin with in comparison to those government-selected astronauts who are the healthiest of the healthiest people who applied in that round, right? Versus private, it's who's paying. And the person who can pay might not always be the healthiest person, and then if that is the case, what policies do we have in place to say, if that person has a heart attack on launch, what happens? Right? And so that's where it's either way is fine, but it's a matter of understanding and thinking about those kinds of questions and issues and legalities and ethical dilemmas before we get there. And I think Dimitra and Leonard would probably have comments around that as well.
The main advantage, the main difference between a government astronaut and a commercial private astronaut, if you want to call them this way at the moment, is that the first one is going through a framework of processes, resources that have safety as a priority, because this is how that framework has been developed. That is not the case with commercial activities at the moment, because they have not developed yet that way. If, as they develop, we bring that level, if not higher, sure, why not send whoever is able to pay. It's not inclusive as it should be. It is an aspect of commercial business. But from the legal point of view, this is the main difference. We really don't hold the two astronauts on the same safety standards. And that is actually impacting, at the moment, the private astronauts, because they don't have the same safeguards as a government astronaut, who also has received a training that usually lets them by themselves overcome some safety issues, even if they come up. I will leave it at that because it's something that's developing at the moment, and we see whether it develops the right way so we can compare the two differently in the future.
Great question. Thank you for asking. And just to confirm, before I answer, your question was around human spaceflight, first to Mars, government versus commercial versus private, like that flavor of question. Broken record, right? Like, it depends on why we're going. If you're trying to climb Mount Everest and you're using your own money and you're, being mindful of, the path you take to not damage the natural environment and leave litter, and you're being respectful of the physical environment, and you have done your training to try and get there, and you happen to perish, and there's no expectation for someone else to spend government money to try and rescue you, then why shouldn't you feel empowered to adventure? If you're trying to go to space to conduct research, to extract value and improve life back on Earth in a scaled way that is being directed for the benefit of a certain demographic of people or for the maximum number of people that will suffer or continue to suffer if you fail, then that has a different risk profile and a different safety standard and a different level of rigor and risk management associated with it. If you're going to space, where it's predominantly a mathematical equation about for every dollar that I put into this, how many dollars do I get out per unit time, and you almost don't, there's lots of things outside of that equation that you don't really take into account, then perhaps there's critique you can make about that in there not being enough rigor and enough standard and enough care in the way that you're going there. So a little bit of a roundabout way to ask, but it depends on why you're going to Mars. If you're going there to extract resources and bring it back to Earth, well then maybe that is something that warrants a little bit more mindfulness and consideration and rigor. If you're going there to try and conduct scientific research and perishing of the astronauts is an unacceptable solution because they're representatives of the government and they're being funded to achieve a certain outcome that's going to help life on Earth, and you care about the individual identity of the crew as well as the collective identity of the work that will be done once they come back, then maybe that deserves a higher standard of rigor and attention and risk management. But if someone is using their own dollars and is being respectful of the environment that they're going through to get there, and they're doing it from an exploration and adventuring perspective, and they're not trying to generate value for a shareholder, they're doing it for exploration and adventure, which a lot of humanity's development has happened that same way throughout history. Look at any number of examples, right? Like Antarctica, discovering new lands, going out into the oceans for the first time. And sure, some of those were sponsored by governments. Some of those were commercial entities. Some of those were commercial entities sponsored by governments. Some of those were rich individuals that wanted to go explore themselves. It depends why you're going there, and I think that shapes the risk profile and some of the rigor that should go behind it.
Hi, good evening. My question is to Dr. Halloway. This is regarding space medicine. What is your view on cell therapy? a trip to Mars, we are talking about 2 to 3 years. Most of the medicines which we may carry may expire. Either we have to manufacture medicines in space, or we have to think about some alternative therapy like cell therapy. What is your view on cell therapy?
So, given that I've heard a lot of talks in some of the NASA conferences, I think we're on our way to manufacturing medication in plants along the right path. When it comes to cell therapy, beyond that, I don't know enough about where we are to give true comment about anything else. But when it comes to utilization of cell therapy to provide medication in a timely fashion, but only when needed, kind of leading back to the utilization of part of the root, where the plants can be eaten and eaten by everyone, but then we can use cell therapy to create medicine in a certain set of plants at a specific time when that medication is needed. We're on the path to get there, and I think that that is a great strategy for utilization of multiple different things, for multiple different pathways, so that we reduce the amount of resources we need to take with us, and we can produce the things we need as we need it. But when it comes to other things, like regeneration of organs or things like that, cell therapy-wise, we're not anywhere near there on human sides of things. There's a lot of animal research going on for Earth-based production of that, but we're not anywhere near where it would be utilizable in space at this point.
So first of all, thank you so much for your insights. So I have a question about, so we have a weather forecast system for the Earth, but why don't we have it for the Mars, considering that we already have like, a lot of missions for the Mars, and like we have more in the future, and we're also like planning for human exploration for the Mars. So considering also like the dust storms that hit like Mars so often, so why are we not considering to have a weather forecast system for the Mars as well?
So maybe I'll respond first, and maybe others will chime in. Well, the atmosphere of Mars is very different from Earth. And so that's why in earlier comments I was saying that the Mars surface isn't quite as dynamic compared to Earth, is because, well, here we do have like a very complex atmospheric system with a stratosphere, troposphere, and so on. And all of our weather systems, you can see, are in the troposphere. That's also why when we're in space and we look back on Earth, we see this blue marble, right? Because there's all these complex weather systems, you have lightning and so on. The Mars also has an atmosphere, but it is different from, and we'll defer to space scientists, you know, to get into the atmospheric chemistry and so on. But I think that also when we're talking about weather systems and meteorology, and if we're talking about weather forecast, well, again, it gets into, well, what is it used for, right? And so if we do have settlements on Mars, for example, or if we have like a permanent presence on Mars, then there might be a need, right, for some such weather forecasting systems. You know, maybe things like I've also heard from TP Lunar about the possibility of having a navigation system, right, around Moon, and you might extend that into why not have a navigation system around Mars, and so on. But you really need to have an audience for that, users for that, in other words. From the commercial side is clients, you know, for that. And if we don't have that presence of Mars, that maybe we don't need that at this time. That might change with ISRU and space mining, for example. Then maybe we do want to forecast weather more precisely for when we're going to actually extract resources. We do want to know wind, for example, erosion rates, and so on. So yeah, that's a really, really interesting, fascinating question.
Hello, thank you very much. It's okay? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Hello, thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. how should we budget the whole endeavor? And should that budget be national, international, as humans? How do we prioritize also this according to many other things that we need to do? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you for asking. Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record. It depends why we're going there. That shapes the budget profile. If you're a commercial company that's publicly traded and you're going there to try and generate commercial value and return it to shareholders and continue to grow and capture larger portions of the market, whatever market that might be and however you define it, then your budget profile is going to be akin to the shape of your commercial entity. Right? Like if you're a VC fund trying to invest in an initiative to go to Mars for the first time, it's going to be very different from if you're a publicly traded multinational corporation and you're trying to put it within your project portfolio that you're executing against. There'll be a much lower risk profile from a corporation from a budgeting perspective compared to one from a VC or equivalent, right? And all the variations of investing risk in between. If you're going there from a government's perspective and you're using government taxpayer dollars and you're doing that, you're spending money on that initiative instead of spending it on domestic priorities or national security priorities, then the way that you look at the budgeting is going to be very different, right? Because what you're getting from, when you spend $1, you're spending a resource and you're expecting something from it, right? And it's not just from a pure dollar in, dollar out perspective. That's the way it manifests here. But it's even for every minute that I spend, with this person, how much am I enjoying their company, right? Like the same form happens everywhere. But from a financial investment and budgetary perspective, you're expecting something at the end of the journey. And if at the end of the journey it's to benefit the people that have paid taxes towards the government's fund that is spending money towards going to Mars, then what are you getting for that compared to the same amount of money being spent on domestic healthcare programs or other types of education and domestic programs from the country that the budget's coming from? Because the size of it's going to look different. And then if you are a rich individual who is choosing to go there of your own accord, you don't need to justify it to a minister or a government or an elected body that voted you into office. You don't need to explain it to a board of directors who can replace you or a group of shareholders to whom you're accountable for delivering value. If you're doing it based on your own accord and spending your own money and you have enough to go to Mars, then there's a different risk profile attached to the budget that you are using to go there. And so I say that in the context of why you're going there shapes the risk profile that you attach to the budget. Because the risk profile attached to the budget now starts to shape the size of the budget itself, which is kind of what your question was. Now, if you're asking, is it 10 billion or 10 trillion, I don't really have an answer numerically for that. But that number will be driven by the risk profile, which is attached to the why you're going to Mars in the first place.
Yeah, I completely agree with Leonard. I think that we're still in this place where we're struggling as to why we want to go to Mars. And I think that there's different reasons for it. Maybe just looking back on your own experience here at ISU SSP 25, we had a fundamental workshop that was all about space debate. Hopefully this is ringing a bell. It seems like light years ago, but it wasn't. And in that space debate, we had that question of Moon or Mars. And I think that Tanya and I were quite surprised, pleasantly surprised, that everyone gathered on the side of the room of Moon. There were a few people, from Mars. And then we asked about the rationale for why you need the Moon and Mars. And I think even those who were really advocating for Mars had varied reasons. Some were like, well, because, we need to just prove that we can do it, right? Others was like, maybe for resources and so on. So as Leonard was saying is that, it really depends on the purpose. If it's about resources, that probably entails some sort of private enterprise and private need. But if we're thinking along the lines of Elon Musk, who is always saying we need a backup, right? We need a backup for Earth. And if it's a really dire situation that we really need to go to another planet, then that's probably going to entail some government, role in there. So I think it, really depends again.
Fascinating question, and one that we're going to have to close on because of time. So we we started with one question, preparing for Mars, and we kind of finished with another one. Why are we going? So let's work on answering that one next, okay? That'll be our homework to everyone now. Why are we going? What are we going for? What do we want to accomplish with our space exploration? There's plenty of good answers to that question, and we're looking forward to hearing yours later. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation tonight. Thank you to everyone who's watching this online. For the folks in the room, we can continue a little bit of casual conversation as we head out this evening. Please feel free to greet our panelists on the way out. Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists.